my name is Barnaby and I'm a guitar maker and repairer living here in Tokyo. And I'm always interested in unusual guitars. And a few weeks ago I uploaded a video where I talked about this guitar, the Casio MG-500, which is a MIDI guitar. You can blend the pickups and the MIDI sounds and all sorts of things. And it's a really cool guitar. This one is obviously based on a Strat shape. But there's another version which I had really wanted and had not been able to get hold of, which was Casio taking this idea and putting it into a kind of more modern form. Well, modern for the 1980s. And that is this guitar, the Casio MG-500. And so when you look at the body, you can see it's a kind of ergonomic shape. It doesn't have a top horn. The body is abbreviated, and it's actually remarkably comfortable to play. So, in other respects, these guitars are identical. They've got the same neck. They've got the same hardware, including the same bridge, the same pickups, the same MIDI gear, the same controls. All that stuff is identical. There are some minor differences. The back of the neck on the MG-500 is well, see-through, it's clear maple. The back of the neck on this one is obviously painted, it's black, but those are really small differences. Aside from that, they're basically the same guitar with just a slightly different body shape. So, the MG-500, what is it and why do I love it? Well, when I got my MG-500, it wasn't in great condition. The frets were a real mess, the hardware was really crusty. This one, in general, has just been looked after a bit better. In fact, I've taken the covers off the back here, and you can see, perhaps, that the springs here look really good. They look like they haven't been touched. No sign of the typical acid from fingertips and things. I've also taken off the covers here so we can look at these dip switches and potentiometers later on. When I took out the battery cover, and this one has a battery cover, my MG-500 didn't, it was missing. But when I took the battery cover out from here, I discovered that the cavity looked like it had never been opened. And that told me that probably whoever owned this was most likely to have played it as a regular guitar. They probably didn't even have anything for connecting the MIDI stuff. So the MIDI things haven't been used. When you look at these three switches here, which are controlling the MIDI functions, they don't have any kind of dirt or grime on them at all. They've clearly not been touched. This knob, which is the MIDI and guitar pickup blend, or MIDI volume, rather, this doesn't have any crustiness to it at all, whereas the volume knob really does. So when we look at the parts that are used on a regular guitar, you know, the frets, the bridge, all that sort of stuff, those have been treated as if this has been an instrument someone played. But when we look at the electronic parts, or anything that was hidden behind screws and covers, it just hasn't been touched. So I don't know who owned this guitar, but I think they just used it as a regular guitar. Now, some things about it, whoever did own it had a go at leveling the frets. And they didn't do a terrible job of it, but they didn't really finish it. So they've leveled them with something, some kind of sanding beam, but the frets themselves then are quite flat on the top and they're not polished. So they're going to need recrowning and they're going to need to be polished to bring the frets up. Either that or I'll simply replace the frets at some point in the future. Other things to mention, the bridge was set up all wrong. The intonation was extremely bad and the action was set up to be really high. Now this arm is an aftermarket arm made by Goto. I don't really like it on here because it tends to hit these controls. And it's really inconvenient. When it's here, it's in your way, and when you put it back, it tends to bump into these dials and switches, and it's really an annoying thing. So I need to find a better alternative for that. So let's have a look at this guitar and have a look at how the controls work. First of all, we've got regular magnetic pickups. So that's our neck pickup. Come down here, neck and middle, middle, middle and humbucker, and humbucker, which can have one coil or two based on the use of that switch. There's also a tone control. So for example, we can really roll it off, okay? So that's all standard stuff that you would expect on pretty well any electric guitar. Single coil humbucker in this case, splittable humbucker. But where the guitar gets really cool and really interesting is when we start to get into this panel down here where we've got all the MIDI stuff. Now there's a switch here to turn it on. You can also see two cables coming out. This is the guitar sound, magnetic pickups. This is the MIDI cable, and that goes into a MIDI unit. I'm using the S-Engine MIDI Plus, but really you can use anything. So let's see what these controls do. Of our switches, the first switch that we find next to the MIDI volume has guitar, guitar and MIDI, and then just MIDI. So if it's guitar, it's the pickups. If we move to guitar and MIDI, there's the guitar sound and the MIDI sound together, and then just MIDI. Which is obviously a piano sound. So that's just our MIDI. And we can control the volume of that from here. Which also allows us further possibilities for blending as we work with the guitar. We can also change the octave of the MIDI function. So if this middle of the three switches is away from me, pushed down, we get the lower pitch. Here's normal, and towards me, the octave up. And right at the end is a really interesting switch, and this switch has some very cool functions. In its upper position, away from me, it's got what we call normal, and this controls how the sound is bent. So for example, there's a slight pitch bend there. However, if we put it to chromatic, instead of having a pitch bend, it will actually simply skip to the next note. So, right? And then the last function, which is really amazing, is something called change. And this sends a message to the MIDI controller. And what that message does is change the MIDI sound. So what we do is, let's put this over. There will be a flashing light here. When that light is flashing, you play a pitch. And that pitch corresponds to a new MIDI sound. There we are. Okay, now let's do it again. So if you know what you're aiming for, you can use this switch to change the MIDI without needing to go to the unit. You just need to know which pitch on the guitar corresponds to the sound that you want to use. And of course, your choice of MIDI tones, as always with these things, is really determined by the module that you're using rather than the guitar. The guitar doesn't have any MIDI sounds in it. Now, Casio did a later guitar, or two, the PG-300 and the PG-380, and those have onboard MIDI sounds. They're kind of cheesy and electronic keyboardy. So really, the best way to do it is to do this, is to run out to a MIDI module and create your sound. Now, on the back, there are some things that I think it's worth having a kind of close look at and just explaining what they are. So normally we have a couple of rubber covers which fit on here, but I've taken them off to show some controls that are actually really important for setting this guitar up correctly. First of all, we've got a series of mini switches here, and these mini switches are numbered, and each switch kind of has a different function. So switches 1 to 5 are controlling mono or polyphonic mode functions. And that's all setting up synthesizers and doing terribly clever things with how the strings respond to different voices. So if you want to have, say, an upper voice of a piano and the lower voice of a double bass or something. So that's what those switches will do. Switches 6 and 7, those are going to control the bend range of your notes. So they'll control how far you can pitch shift. And then switches 8 and 9 will control the bass frequency of the MIDI signal that you get. So whether your A will be 440 Hertz, 441, 42 or 443. So you can change the pitch of the guitar a small amount. You can't move up and down by a semitone, but you can kind of adjust to common pitches. And then here we have 6 little potentiometers, and these are surface mounted potentiometers, and these can be adjusted with a Phillips head screwdriver or something else. Now, what these do is they adjust the individual sensitivity of the pickups which are on the other side, and I'll show you those in a moment. So when you turn them one way, what will happen is they'll make the pickup more sensitive, more of the signal will come through. You turn it the other way and you'll make the pickup less sensitive. That means, for example, that if your bass MIDI voices are overwhelming, you can turn the bass down a bit and you can turn up the sensitivity in your treble voices, or do that the other way around. Whichever you want, you set up the guitar so it's optimal. If I turn it over, we can see the pickup itself. This is the hexaphonic pickup. Each of these is actually 2 little magnetic coils, very low output. They send out their signal, it goes into the MIDI processor and gets turned into a signal and sent out again. But you can control the sensitivity of each one of these. You can also raise or lower the pickup itself relative to the strings, and you can set it up for whatever response curve you would like from this guitar. So a lot of people with these guitars don't really know what all these functions are. They don't know how to set it up. But if you do spend the time, you can really set this guitar up so that it's extremely sensitive.